What if the most epic rescue mission in history wasn't just about saving lives, but about fulfilling an eternal promise? Dive deep into the monumental floating sanctuary that defied a global catastrophe and discover hidden significance far beyond its physical dimensions. This isn't just a story. It's a foundational truth. The Ark, a floating sanctuary, God's promise. There's a story buried in nearly every ancient culture on Earth, a flood, a catastrophic deluge that wiped out civilization. And here's what makes your spine tingle. These stories don't just share a theme, they share disturbingly specific details. The Mesopotamians wrote about it 4,800 years ago. The ancient Greeks had their version. Indigenous tribes in Australia, the Americas, even isolated Pacific islands, all of them describe the same event. A flood that reset humanity. But here's where it gets weird. Modern geological surveys have found evidence of massive flooding events in multiple regions dating back thousands of years. So, what actually happened? Was Noah's Ark real, or are we looking at something else entirely? And why does this one story refuse to die? Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover might change how you see ancient history forever. The universal mystery. Let me ask you something. How do you explain over 200 independent flood myths from cultures that never contacted each other? I'm not talking about vague similarities. I'm talking about specific, haunting parallels. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the gods about an upcoming flood. He builds a massive boat, brings his family, and loads it with animals. Sound familiar? But here's the thing, this story predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years. Then you've got the Hindu Matsya Purana, where the god Vishnu warns a man named Manu about a flood that will destroy all creatures. Manu builds a boat. In Chinese mythology, there's Gunyu and the Great Flood. The Aztecs spoke of Nahuatl, a world-ending flood. The Incas had Viracocha. In Greek mythology, Zeus flooded the earth, and only Deucalion and his wife survived on a boat. And it's not just old civilizations. The Ojibwe people of North America tell of Nanabaza surviving a great flood on a raft with animals. Australian Aboriginal stories describe a time when the seas rose and swallowed the land. Now, here's where your brain should be buzzing with questions. Are all these cultures just really creative storytellers who coincidentally picked the same plot? Or did something actually happen? The Noah narrative. Let's zoom in on the most famous version. Genesis, chapters 6 through 9. You probably know the basics, but the details are what matter here. According to the text, God observes that humanity has become corrupt and violent. He decides to send a flood to wipe the slate clean, but one man, Noah, is described as righteous. God instructs Noah to build an ark with extremely specific dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That translates to roughly 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. For context, that's about 1.5 football fields in length. Noah is told to bring his family 8 people total and representatives of every animal species, 7 pairs of clean animals, 1 pair of unclean animals. Then it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The floodwaters cover the entire earth for 150 days. Eventually, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat in modern-day Turkey. But here's what most people miss. The account is shockingly detailed for something written thousands of years ago. It specifies the ark should be made of gopher wood, coated with pitch inside and out. It describes 3 decks, a door on the side, and a window a cubit from the top. These aren't the kind of vague details you'd expect from pure mythology. And then there's the physics question that keeps naval engineers up at night. Could a wooden vessel that size actually float? Could it survive a global catastrophe? Hold that thought, because the answer is more surprising than you'd think. The engineering challenge. In 1993, a group of Korean naval architects at the Korea Research Institute of Ships and Ocean Engineering did something fascinating. They ran computer simulations testing the seaworthiness of Noah's Ark using the biblical dimensions. Their conclusion: the Ark would have been incredibly stable even in rough seas. The length-to-width ratio of 6:1 is almost exactly what modern cargo ships use for optimal stability. Too long and narrow, it capsizes. Too wide, it's unstable in waves. The proportions described in Genesis hit a sweet spot that engineers didn't mathematically understand until the 1800s. But would hold together at that size? The largest wooden ships ever built were the 19th century six-masted schooners, maxing out around 350 feet. They had serious structural problems: wood flexes, joints fail, hulls leak. So, how could a 510-foot wooden vessel survive? Here's the key: the Ark wasn't designed to sail. It wasn't meant to navigate or steer. According to the text, it was essentially a massive floating box. And that changes everything. Without the stress of sails, rigging, or directional forces, a rectangular barge can handle far greater length. Modern naval architects have confirmed this. A vessel designed purely for floating, not maneuvering, can absolutely work at those dimensions. But now we need to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the millions of elephants. The animal problem. This is where skeptics usually plant their flag. How do you fit every animal species on Earth onto one boat? The numbers seem impossible. There are roughly 8.7 million species alive today. Even if you only take 2 of each, you're looking at over 17 million animals. That's clearly not fitting on any boat. But wait, let's actually read what the text says. It doesn't say species in the modern scientific sense. It says kinds, a broader category. Think about dogs. Wolves, coyotes, dingoes, domestic dogs, they're all one kind with incredible genetic diversity. You don't need 2 of each breed. You need 2 canines. Modern creation scientists estimate you'd need around 1,400 to 7,000 animal kinds on the Ark. That's roughly 14,000 to 28,000 individual animals. Still a lot, but now we're in the realm of possibility. And here's something else. You wouldn't bring full-grown elephants. You'd bring young animals. Smaller, easier to care for, longer reproductive lifespan ahead of them. The average animal size on the Ark would have been about the size of a sheep. But even if we solve the space problem, how do 8 people feed tens of thousands of animals for over a year? How do they manage waste? How do they prevent disease fighting or animals eating each other? These are valid questions. And interestingly, some ancient texts provide clues we usually ignore. The flood evidence debate. So let's talk geology. Is there any physical evidence of a worldwide flood? The honest answer: it's complicated and fiercely debated. Mainstream geologists point to the rock record and say no. We don't see a single global flood layer. What we do see is millions of years of gradual deposition, erosion, plate tectonics, and localized flooding events. But here's where it gets interesting. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating ancient Mesopotamian sites when he discovered an 11-foot layer of water-deposited clay between Wool layers of human civilization. No pottery, no artifacts, just flood sediment. He believed he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. Modern archaeologists think he found evidence of a massive regional flood around 2900 BC. Then there's the Black Sea deluge hypothesis, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1997. Their research suggests that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea catastrophically breached into the Black Sea region, raising water levels by hundreds of feet and flooding thousands of square miles of inhabited land. The flood would have been so sudden and devastating that it could have become the source material for ancient flood myths. This theory remains controversial, but geological core samples do show a dramatic transition from freshwater lake to saltwater sea around that time period. And then there are the marine fossils. High in the Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, we find fossils of ocean creatures thousands of feet above sea level. How'd they get there? The cultural memory. Here's what fascinates anthropologists. These flood stories aren't just similar, they often include identical survival strategies and moral frameworks. A righteous man is warned. He builds a boat. He brings his family and animals. The flood destroys everyone else. He sends out birds to test for dry land. The survivors repopulate the earth. These narrative beats repeat across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. So, what explains it? There are three main theories. First, collective false memory. Humans experienced countless localized floods throughout history. Our pattern-seeking brains merged these into one archetypal great flood story that spread through early trade routes and oral tradition. Second, a real regional megaflood. Perhaps 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, melting ice age glaciers caused catastrophic flooding in key regions where early civilizations clustered: Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean basin, coastal areas. Survivors spread, carrying the traumatic memory encoded in story. Third, a literal global flood as described in Genesis. Proponents argue the geological record could support this if interpreted through a different framework: rapid catastrophism rather than slow uniformism. Which theory is correct? That depends partly on your worldview, partly on how you interpret evidence, and partly on questions science alone can't answer. But there's one more angle we need to explore, and it might be the most important: the deeper meaning. Here's what we often miss while debating dimensions and animals. These stories are fundamentally about something else. Every ancient flood narrative shares a moral core. Humanity becomes corrupt. Violence and evil spread. A reset becomes necessary. But one family preserves goodness, and from them, the world begins again. Whether you read Noah's story as literal history or as profound mythology, it's asking the same questions we face today. What happens when society loses its moral center? Can we rebuild after catastrophe? Is there hope for human nature? The Rainbow Covenant at the end of the Genesis account isn't just a nice detail. God promises never to destroy the earth by flood again, and gives the rainbow as a sign of that promise. It's a narrative about judgment, yes, but ultimately about mercy, second chances, and the possibility of renewal. And maybe that's why this story won't die. Because every generation faces its own floods, literal or metaphorical. Wars, pandemics, environmental collapse, economic crisis. We're hardwired to wonder, could we survive? Would we deserve to? What would we try to save? The ark becomes a symbol, not just of survival, but of deliberate preservation. Noah didn't just grab what was easiest, he carefully selected what was worth carrying into the new world. What would you bring on your ark? So where does this leave us? Was Noah's ark real? If you're asking whether a man named Noah built a 510-foot boat and survived a global flood exactly as described in Genesis, that's a question of faith, interpretation, and how you weigh evidence. The archaeological and geological record doesn't provide clear proof one way or another. But if you're asking whether humanity experienced catastrophic flooding events that became embedded in our collective memory, the answer is almost certainly yes. Whether global or regional, Whether one event or many merged into one story, water-based catastrophes shaped early human civilization. And if you're asking whether the story of Noah's Ark still matters, absolutely. It matters because we're still asking the same questions, still wondering if we can survive our own worst impulses, still looking for something solid to hold onto when everything else washes away. The genius of the Noah narrative isn't in whether every cubit was exact. It's in holding up a mirror to human nature and asking, what are you building? What are you preserving? When the floods come, and they always come, what will remain? That's the real question the ark poses, and it's one each of us has to answer for ourselves. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think: history, metaphor, or something in between.